The 17th century was a time of turbulence and transformation, a period in which old certainties were being torn apart and new frameworks of thought were emerging. England in particular stood at the heart of this upheaval. Civil war, regicide, the rise and fall of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, the eventual restoration of the monarchy, all of this created an atmosphere of deep instability. Society seemed at once fractured and hopeful, caught between the collapse of traditional order and the promise of renewal. Across the Channel, the rest of Europe was also in motion. Empires fought over territory, trade routes, and influence, while new cities and universities became centers of intellectual exchange. The medieval worldview, with its reliance on scholastic reasoning and religious authority, was giving way to a more restless, questioning spirit. This was the backdrop for what historians call the scientific revolution, a phrase that only partially captures the profound shift taking place. For centuries, knowledge of the natural world had been governed by Aristotle and the Church Fathers, their words treated as unquestionable. But by the 17th century, thinkers had begun to challenge those authorities with increasing boldness. Galileo pointed his telescope at the heavens and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, a discovery that shook the very foundations of cosmology. Johannes Kepler described the elliptical paths of planets, introducing a mathematics that hinted at order behind celestial motion. René Descartes urged people to rely on methodical doubt and clear reasoning, setting the stage for a new philosophy of science. Francis Bacon, with his call for careful experimentation, proposed that knowledge must be drawn from nature itself, not from inherited texts. Europe was beginning to imagine a universe governed not by inscrutable mystery but by laws that could be measured, written, and understood. And yet, the paradox of the time was striking. While these bold ideas were circulating among scholars and curious minds, the wider political landscape was still mired in violence and division. In England, civil war pitted neighbour against neighbour, parliament against king. Religious fervour ran high, with Puritans, Anglicans, and Catholics clashing bitterly over the soul of the nation. The public scaffoldings and political executions contrasted painfully with the quiet observations of natural philosophers who studied the movements of stars or the behaviour of falling bodies. Out of chaos, a desire for order grew ever stronger. The notion that the universe itself might be ruled by simple, comprehensible principles was not only a scientific idea but also a yearning for stability in a fractured age. It was in this world that Isaac Newton would rise to prominence, and in many ways he embodied the very tension of his time. On the one hand, he was a man of solitude and inward focus, working alone in his study, carrying out experiments far from the noise of politics. On the other hand, the structures of politics and society touched his life directly, shaping the opportunities he had and the recognition he eventually gained. He grew up in the countryside of Lincolnshire, far from the centres of power, yet his ideas would come to dominate the intellectual world of London, Paris, and beyond. What made Newton unique was his ability to weave together the diverse strands of 17th century thought, mathematics, philosophy, observation, experiment, into a unified vision that would endure long after the wars and disputes of his age had faded into memory. To understand Newton's significance, one must imagine the intellectual climate before him. Astronomy was advancing, but it still lacked a universal explanation. Physics was emerging from Aristotelian frameworks, but it had not yet found a clear structure. Mathematics was being extended, yet its power to describe nature remained largely untapped. Many thinkers contributed pieces of the puzzle, but the picture was incomplete. What Newton accomplished was not simply to add another piece, but to draw the entire puzzle together. He showed that the same principles explaining the fall of an apple on Earth also governed the motion of the moon and planets in the sky. He transformed optics into a science of light and color. He invented new mathematical tools, calculus, that allowed him to describe motion and change with precision. The scattered efforts of his predecessors became in his hands a coherent system. The magnitude of this achievement cannot be overstated. For centuries, humans had looked at the heavens with awe, convinced that celestial bodies obeyed rules distinct from earthly matter. The earth was thought heavy, corruptible, subject to decay, while the heavens were seen as perfect, eternal, governed by their own mysterious order. Newton shattered that divide. By applying the same principles of motion and gravity to both earth and sky, he unified the cosmos into one grand system. No longer were there two realms, terrestrial and celestial. There was only one universe, operating under the same laws everywhere. In a time when politics divided people and religion splintered communities, the idea of a universal order written into the fabric of nature had profound resonance. It is also important to see Newton not only as a man of science but as a thinker deeply rooted in the philosophical and even theological debates of his era. He did not view his work as separate from questions of God or creation. For Newton, uncovering the mathematical structure of the universe was itself a way of glimpsing the divine order. The laws of motion and gravitation were not just clever theories, they were, in his eyes, reflections of the Creator's design. This blending of rational inquiry with spiritual conviction was typical of the age, when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and religion were still fluid. But in Newton's case, the blend was uniquely powerful. His authority rested not only on his discoveries but also on his ability to present them as part of a larger truth about the cosmos and humanity's place within it. When we look back from the 21st century, surrounded by technologies and theories that Newton himself could scarcely have imagined, it is easy to take his influence for granted. Our modern worldview, with its confidence in laws of nature, in mathematics as the language of the universe, in the power of experiment, bears his imprint. Even where later science has revised or surpassed his conclusions, the structure he built remains foundational. Relativity and quantum mechanics may describe realms he never knew, but they still work within the basic framework that he pioneered, that nature is lawful, measurable, and intelligible. In this sense, Newton stands not just as a historical figure but as a continuing presence in how we think about the world. Yet to truly appreciate him, one must resist the temptation to see him only as the finished icon of genius. He was a man of his time, shaped by its conflicts and opportunities, carrying its anxieties and hopes. The England of his youth was a place of uncertainty and upheaval, and the Europe of his maturity was a continent still searching for intellectual and social stability. That Newton was able to rise above this, to find in the midst of turmoil the calm clarity of universal law, is part of what makes his story so compelling. His life is not only the tale of discoveries but also the drama of a solitary mind wrestling with the vastness of nature against the background of a fractured world. And so, as we prepare to follow the path of Newton's life, from his fragile beginnings in a rural village to his triumphs as one of history's greatest thinkers, it is worth remembering the setting in which he lived. A century of war and revolution, of brilliant ideas and fierce disputes, of collapse and renewal. Into this century was born a child whose very survival seemed unlikely, and yet whose mind would come to reshape humanity's understanding of the cosmos. But to understand how this genius emerged, we must go back to the very origins of his life, to that distant winter of 1642. Isaac Newton's story begins in a quiet corner of rural England, in the small hamlet of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, where on Christmas Day in 1642 a frail infant was brought into the world. The midwives who attended his birth had little hope that he would live beyond the night. The baby was so small, so weak, that he seemed destined to vanish before life had properly begun. His mother, Hannah Ayscough, had already known sorrow. Her husband, also named Isaac Newton, had died only months before the child was born, leaving her widowed at 23. Thus Newton entered the world as a fatherless son, fragile in body and precarious in circumstance, a child marked by both absence and uncertainty. The England into which he was born was itself shaken. The year 1642 saw the outbreak of civil war between King Charles I and Parliament, a conflict that would tear the nation apart. In a sense, Newton's personal fragility mirrored the fragility of his homeland. His family belonged to the yeoman class, comfortable but not wealthy, living by farming and landholding. Yet even in this relatively stable rural environment, loss and change left their mark on the boy's earliest years. Hannah, perhaps overwhelmed by her widowhood, eventually remarried and moved away to live with her new husband, leaving young Isaac in the care of his grandmother. The boy was not yet 3. This separation would shape Newton profoundly. The child who remained behind at Woolsthorpe grew up with the sense that his mother had abandoned him. His stepfather, Reverend Barnabas Smith, does not appear to have welcomed him warmly, and the bond between Newton and his mother was strained for much of his life. Later writings suggest he carried a wound from this experience, a feeling of being unwanted that reinforced his natural solitude. Even as a boy he seemed withdrawn, watchful, inclined to retreat into himself rather than seek company. Yet solitude also gave space for imagination. Left often to his own devices, Isaac developed habits of close observation. He would watch the movements of animals, the way shadows shifted across the ground, the workings of simple tools. He had a knack for tinkering, and from an early age he began building small contraptions, kites, sundials, miniature mills driven by running water. Neighbors recalled that the boy had an unusual patience for detail, lingering over mechanisms that others would quickly grow bored with. There was in him an instinct not only to play but to understand, to take apart and see how things worked, to reconstruct with an improvement of his own. This quiet industriousness contrasted with his social life, which was meager. He did not blend easily with other children and often preferred solitude to the rough games of the village. When he did interact, it was sometimes with a stubborn competitiveness, as if he sought to prove himself in other ways. Stories survive of his determination to excel in small contests, flying a kite higher, carving a better toy, drawing a sharper sketch. His ambition, once stirred, did not allow him to rest until he had surpassed his rivals. Beneath the reserved exterior there was a fierce energy, a drive that might have gone unnoticed at first but which grew steadily stronger. The household at Woolsthorpe offered few luxuries, but it did provide books, and young Newton showed an eagerness to read. The Bible was central in the Puritan world of Lincolnshire, and Isaac absorbed its language and rhythms early on. He would later develop deep religious interests, though unconventional in form, and the roots of that fascination lay in the atmosphere of his childhood. Alongside scripture, he pored over any scrap of knowledge he could find, be it practical manuals, almanacs, or simple arithmetic. Each piece of information became material for reflection, fuel for a mind that seemed always hungry. Observers at the time may not have predicted greatness. To many in the village he was just a thin, quiet boy with little talent for farming, unlikely to inherit the practical role expected of him. When Hannah considered recalling him from school to help manage the estate, some thought it a sensible choice. Newton himself, however, resisted the prospect of a farmer's life. His temperament, unsuited to the rhythms of plowing and planting, leaned toward study. It is possible that the very frailty of his early body, the knowledge that he had once been close to death, gave him a certain detachment from ordinary concerns, as though he lived in a different dimension from those around him. Even in his childhood there was an odd duality in his character, on the one hand the vulnerable, abandoned boy, on the other the determined observer, already showing hints of the discipline that would later make him a scientist. He could be moody, even difficult, yet beneath his silences there was always thought at work. He had begun to build for himself an inner world that would prove more durable and rewarding than the uncertain affections of his family. One might imagine him in the yard at Woolsthorpe, setting up a crude sundial from stones and sticks, watching the shadow crawl with the hours, sensing in that motion a hidden order. Or alone in his room, carving models of windmills, imagining them scaled up into mighty engines. These were not the idle games of a child, but early rehearsals for a lifetime of curiosity. The capacity to notice, to linger, to persist, these were qualities already present, quietly shaping the boy who would one day transform science. As the years passed, the pain of separation from his mother remained, but it was joined by a growing self-reliance. If love and approval were uncertain, there was always the certainty of numbers, of the way a mechanism turned, of the predictable path of the sun across the sky. In these patterns Newton found a kind of stability that human relationships had denied him. The world outside could be fractured, but within nature there were laws waiting to be discovered, and even as a child he seemed to sense that truth. In retrospect, it is tempting to see these early experiences as foreshadowing the man he would become. His isolation bred independence. His frailty gave him patience and resilience. His sense of abandonment drove him inward, where he discovered the power of disciplined thought. Yet at the time, all this was still latent, forming quietly in a boy who had not yet shown his full potential. To his family he remained something of an enigma, and to himself perhaps even more so. This was Isaac Newton's beginning, a fragile infant, a lonely child, a boy of hidden determination, nurtured not by affection but by his own insistent curiosity. From these unpromising roots would grow a mind of extraordinary reach. But for now he was still a child in Lincolnshire, sketching, tinkering, watching, storing away impressions. This inner energy was looking for an outlet, and soon it found one in Newton's school years. In 1654, Isaac Newton left the quiet fields of Woolsthorpe and entered a new world. He was sent to Grantham, a market town not far from his home, to attend the King's School. For a boy who had lived most of his childhood in the solitude of the countryside, it was a sudden plunge into a busier environment, filled with noise, competition, and the expectations of academic life. The move marked the beginning of his formal education, and though he was far from a natural scholar at the start, these years would prove decisive in shaping his path. Grantham offered him not only a structured curriculum but also exposure to new ideas, books, and people, each of which helped awaken his growing curiosity. At first Newton did not shine. By most accounts, his early performance in school was unimpressive. He seemed distracted, uninterested in the rote memorization that defined much of 17th century education. Teachers considered him an indifferent student, perhaps more suited to the farm work that his family envisioned for him. He was small, quiet, and easily overlooked among his classmates, some of whom mocked him for his apparent weakness. Yet if he lagged in traditional lessons, Newton was already showing signs of a restless imagination. While others recited their Latin lines, he might be scribbling diagrams or tinkering with small devices, seeking out in play the patterns and mechanisms that truly held his attention. A turning point came in a way that reveals much about his character. One day, provoked by a classmate who taunted him for being dull, Newton responded not with fists but with resolve. He threw himself into his studies, determined not only to catch up but to surpass everyone else in the school. What began as a reaction to rivalry quickly became a habit. He worked tirelessly, mastering grammar, rhetoric, and mathematics, climbing from the bottom of the class to its very top. It was as though a fire had been lit inside him, one that would never quite go out. Once engaged, he refused to settle for mediocrity. His pride demanded excellence, and his intensity carried him far beyond what was expected of a boy from a rural family. Outside the classroom, Newton pursued a different kind of education. His lodging in Grantham was with a family of the local apothecary, William Clark. This household provided him access to books and to the tools of a trade that blended practical chemistry with medicine. The apothecary's shelves, filled with jars and powders, may have sparked his early interest in experimentation. He read whatever he could find, from popular almanacs to more serious treatises, and began to keep notebooks filled with sketches and observations. These early scribblings, lists, drawings, half-formed thoughts, show a mind already eager to catalogue and systematize the world. But Newton was not content merely to read. He built. In the yard behind the house or in his schoolroom, he fashioned sundials that kept time with surprising accuracy. He constructed small windmills and water mills, cleverly adapting materials at hand. He made mechanical toys, including carts that moved with the power of wind, and even a lantern fashioned to look like a candle carried by a spirit, which he used to frighten neighbors on dark evenings. These projects were playful, yet they reveal the same qualities that would later define his science: an attention to detail, a fascination with how forces operate, and a desire to translate observation into working models. Despite these bursts of ingenuity, Newton remained socially awkward. He was not a boy who blended easily with his peers. Though he engaged in rivalry and sometimes in fights, his true comfort lay in solitude, immersed in his books and inventions. Others went to games or gatherings. Isaac lingered over drawings of gears or pages of Euclid. He earned a reputation for being quiet and peculiar, a boy who seemed to occupy a world of his own. The rhythms of ordinary adolescent life, companionship, flirtation, the easy flow of conversation, were foreign to him. Instead, he lived inwardly, his imagination absorbed by patterns, diagrams, and the secret workings of things. This separation, though isolating, also gave him strength. Free from the distractions of social life, he cultivated a discipline of observation and invention. He taught himself to see the world not as a surface of appearances but as a system waiting to be understood. The sundial in the garden, the shadow moving hour by hour, the wheel turning under the push of water, all these became lessons in order and motion. For Newton, such experiments were not simply pastimes, they were a way of engaging with reality, of testing his mind against nature. He was, even then, preparing himself for the great leap he would later make, the leap from toys to theories, from small contraptions to universal laws. His teachers began to recognize his abilities. What had once seemed a mediocre student now looked like a prodigy. He absorbed knowledge quickly, and though he could be headstrong, his work showed precision and care. At the King's School he mastered Latin, which would later allow him to read the scientific works of the continent, and he deepened his mathematical skills, setting the stage for the innovations of his university years. In Grantham he moved from the margins to the centre, no longer the overlooked child but the pupil others measured themselves against. Yet Newton's ambition remained largely his own. His family still imagined him returning to the farm, managing the estate as any responsible son should. They did not see education as a lifelong pursuit but as a preparation for practical duties. For a time it seemed that Isaac might indeed be forced back into agricultural work, a prospect he dreaded. He had already tasted the life of the mind, already glimpsed the possibilities of books and experiments, and the thought of spending his days among fields and barns felt like a sentence to exile. He resisted, as he always did when confronted with a challenge, with quiet stubbornness. His determination not to be consigned to farming was as fierce as his earlier determination to outshine his classmates. Looking back, it is striking how much of Newton's later personality was foreshadowed in these school years. The competitiveness, the intensity, the withdrawal into study, the capacity for sustained concentration, the preference for solitary labor over social ease, all these were already in place. He was a boy who did not fit easily into the mold expected of him, but precisely because he did not fit, he developed a mode of life uniquely his own. He lived as though the world of ideas and mechanisms was more real, more compelling, than the world of people around him. As adolescence drew on, this tendency only deepened. Newton was no longer the frail, overlooked child of Woolsthorpe. He had become a student of promise, a young man with a growing reputation for brilliance and eccentricity. His notebooks grew thicker, his devices more ingenious, his readings more ambitious. Grantham had given him both the chance to prove himself against others and the freedom to cultivate his solitary genius. It was the place where his curiosity took tangible form, where his inner energy found its first outlets. When the time came to choose his future, the family did not at first realize how serious Isaac was about knowledge. To them, study was a stage, not a destiny. To him, it had become the very air he breathed. A decision loomed, one that would determine whether he would return to the rhythms of farming or continue on the path of learning. That path led beyond Grantham, beyond Lincolnshire, to a place where the greatest minds of the age gathered and argued. Yet the boy who had once been left alone at Woolsthorpe, who had built sundials and mechanical toys, who had fought his way from the bottom of the class to its summit, already knew what he wanted. The road to Cambridge soon opened before him. In the summer of 1661, Isaac Newton arrived at Cambridge to begin his studies at Trinity College. He was 19 years old, quiet, serious, and still somewhat awkward, but within him burned a determination that few around him could sense. Cambridge in the mid-17th century was both traditional and in transition. Much of the teaching still revolved around Aristotle, scholastic philosophy, and classical texts, yet beneath that surface, new currents of thought were stirring. Across Europe, thinkers such as Descartes, Galileo, Kepler, and Hobbes were reshaping the intellectual landscape. Newton entered at a moment when old and new ideas clashed daily in lecture halls and private circles, and this atmosphere gave him the intellectual fuel he craved. At first, Newton lived modestly. As a subsizar, a student who paid reduced fees in exchange for performing menial duties for wealthier students, he was tasked with chores and service. He had little money, and his early life at the university was marked by frugality and restraint. Yet he cared little for social standing. He spent most of his hours in solitude, haunting the library, filling notebooks with reflections, and seeking out every text he could lay his hands on. Though the official curriculum seemed stale to him, he found inspiration in the works of the moderns, books passed hand to hand among students eager for the newest discoveries. Descartes' geometry, Kepler's Astronomia Nova, Boyle's writings on the mechanical philosophy, all these he devoured eagerly, making meticulous notes in his private journals. One of the first to recognize Newton's potential was Isaac Barrow, a brilliant mathematician and theologian who was then teaching at Cambridge. Barrow's lectures in mathematics and natural philosophy opened new paths for the young scholar, and though Barrow himself could not yet foresee the full scope of Newton's genius, he provided both encouragement and a foundation. Newton's own notes from this period, later collected in what is known as the Waste Book, reveal a mind leaping far beyond the standard instruction. In those pages, he worked through problems of geometry and algebra, extended the methods he read in Descartes, and began formulating ideas that would later crystallize into calculus. At first it was rough, experimental, a personal shorthand of symbols and tentative concepts. But within those scribbles lay the seed of a revolution. Mathematics was not his only fascination. He plunged into natural philosophy, the study of the physical world. The mechanical philosophy, the idea that nature could be explained through matter in motion, like a vast machine, particularly intrigued him. He read Hobbes, whose bold but controversial attempts to reduce everything to mechanics stirred debates across England. He studied Kepler's laws of planetary motion, marveling at their precision. The very idea that celestial bodies could be governed by mathematical rules fired his imagination. Newton's notes suggest he was already asking questions that stretched beyond his sources, seeking not only to absorb knowledge but to extend it. His interest soon turned toward the mysteries of light and color. Cambridge at the time was a place where optics was emerging as a field of great interest, inspired by the discoveries of Kepler and the experiments of Descartes. Newton, never content with theory alone, began experimenting with prisms, mirrors, and lenses. He grew fascinated by the phenomenon of refraction, how light bent when it passed from air into glass. While most accepted the idea that white light was pure, Newton's trials suggested something more complex. By passing a beam of sunlight through a prism and observing the spectrum of colors it produced, he began to suspect that white light was not simple but composed of many different rays. These early experiments, still in their infancy, marked the beginning of his lifelong engagement with optics, an area where his genius would later shine as brightly as in mathematics. Newton's life at Cambridge was outwardly quiet. He was not a student who courted fame or sought leadership among his peers. He rarely participated in social activities, preferring the solitude of his chambers. But those who watched closely could see that he was different, a young man who studied late into the night, filling page after page with symbols, diagrams, and reflections. In a college where most were content to follow the course, Newton pursued his own. He read voraciously, not only in mathematics and natural philosophy but also in philosophy, theology, and even alchemy. He seemed to believe that truth was one, that the mysteries of nature and of God might ultimately be understood through a common language. It was during these years that his habits of work solidified. He displayed an intensity that would characterize his entire career, the ability to focus on a problem with such determination that everything else faded. Hours, even days, could pass as he wrestled with a single difficulty, trying different approaches, scribbling calculations, testing experiments, refusing to let go until he had forced the problem to yield. This relentless concentration, coupled with a profound originality of thought, began to set him apart. Yet even at Cambridge, recognition came slowly. Newton's early brilliance was largely private, hidden in notebooks that few saw. He was not yet a figure of renown but a student working quietly, preparing without knowing it for discoveries that would transform the world. His teachers respected his diligence, but no one yet suspected that in his small room at Trinity College, he was laying the foundations of modern science. The intellectual ferment of the university suited him. Cambridge was a meeting place for ideas, where the works of Bacon and Galileo were discussed, where debates raged about the nature of matter and the authority of ancient texts. For Newton, this ferment was invigorating. He absorbed the controversies, tested arguments against his own reasoning, and little by little began to trust his own judgment above all. He was forming not only his theories but also his intellectual independence. By 1665, he had made remarkable progress. His early formulation of calculus was already taking shape, though still in private notes. His experiments in optics had convinced him that light was composite, a view that challenged accepted opinion. His readings in philosophy had given him a framework for thinking about nature as a system governed by laws, discoverable through mathematics. Without fanfare, he had moved from a provincial boy to a scholar standing at the edge of profound discoveries. But just as his mind was gathering momentum, events beyond his control intervened. In London, the plague broke out with devastating force. The epidemic spread swiftly, and in 1665 the universities were closed to prevent further contagion. Cambridge fell silent as students and scholars fled the city. For Newton, this disruption might have seemed a setback, an interruption in his studies. Yet, in truth, it would prove the opposite. Forced to return home to Woolsthorpe, away from the formalities of lectures and the distractions of the college, he suddenly found himself with time and solitude in abundance. And it was there, in that unlikely retreat, that he entered what he would later call his years of miracles. When the plague swept across England in 1665, shutting down universities and scattering scholars to the countryside, Isaac Newton returned reluctantly to Woolsthorpe, his childhood home. For most students, this sudden seclusion meant an interruption, a pause in learning, a withdrawal from the life of the mind. But for Newton, the isolation became something else entirely, a furnace in which ideas smouldering at Cambridge now flared into brilliance. Cut off from the routines of academic life, freed from lectures and examinations, he found himself alone with his thoughts. The world seemed paralyzed by disease, fields lay untended, towns stood silent, yet in his chamber in Lincolnshire and in the meadows around it, Newton entered into the most creative period of his life. He carried back with him books, notebooks, and the raw beginnings of insights he had been shaping in Cambridge. At Woolsthorpe, without interruption, he could return to them, dwell on them, and push them further. His notebooks from these years reveal a torrent of activity. Ideas long half-formed now coalesced. He took walks in the orchard, sat for hours by a window, bent over papers, and improvised experiments with whatever was at hand. Solitude sharpened his focus. He seemed to live entirely in the realm of numbers, rays of light, and forces unseen. Among the first problems he pursued in earnest was light. Cambridge had given him a taste of optical studies, but now he had time to refine his experiments. He worked with prisms, carefully allowing beams of sunlight to pass through them, projecting vivid bands of color onto walls. What fascinated him was the consistency. No matter how he angled the prism, the sequence of colors remained the same. White light, he realized, was not a pure and simple substance but a mixture of many colored rays, each bending at its own angle. With mirrors and additional prisms, he tested and retested the idea, recombining the spectrum back into white, convincing himself that what most men called simplicity was in fact complexity. This insight was revolutionary. It meant that the prevailing theories, which treated colors as modifications of white light, were mistaken. Instead, white itself was compound, a blend of all the hues. Newton's experiments at Woolsthorpe thus laid the foundation for the optical revolution he would later reveal to the world. But at this stage, the discovery remained private, scrawled in his notes, a treasure he carried silently, unsure of how it would be received. At the same time, his mind leapt across the domain of mathematics. Since his Cambridge days, he had been exploring the problem of change, how to measure quantities that were in motion, how to calculate curves, slopes, and areas that shifted endlessly. The old methods of geometry were inadequate. In his solitude, Newton devised a new approach, a calculus of fluxions, as he called it, a way to treat changing quantities as if they flowed and could be captured in symbols. He experimented with infinite series, developed algorithms, and set down rules that allowed him to calculate with unprecedented power. The young man working alone in Woolsthorpe was, in effect, inventing calculus. His methods were still raw, not yet polished into the forms that later generations would recognize, but the essential insight was there, a new mathematics that could grasp motion and growth, the changing and the continuous. These private labors would one day fuel his great works in physics, astronomy, and beyond. Yet even in his own mind, they seemed more like tools than a finished science, the scaffolding of a structure still to come. It was also during these years that Newton began to turn his thoughts toward the forces that governed the heavens. The question of planetary motion, left hanging by Kepler's laws, pressed on him. Why should the planets trace out ellipses? What kept the moon in its course? Newton pondered the fall of objects on Earth, the apple from the tree, the stone dropped from a hand, and asked whether the same invisible force might extend outward, binding the moon to the Earth to the sun. Gravity, he suspected, was not confined to the familiar world around him but was universal. The same pull that brought an apple earthward might also be the pull that curved the moon's path around the Earth. The story of the falling apple, often told and retold in romanticized form, reflects at least a kernel of truth. Whether or not he actually sat under a tree when the thought struck him, Newton himself later recalled that the notion of gravity's universal reach came to him while reflecting in Woolsthorpe's orchard. He began to imagine a law that would apply everywhere, the same in the skies as on the ground, a principle of unity that explained the motions of planets and projectiles alike. He attempted crude calculations, comparing the force needed to keep the moon in orbit with the pull that caused apples to fall, and though his initial numbers did not yet match perfectly, the seed of universal gravitation was planted. These months and years, when the world outside was ravaged by plague, were for Newton an annus mirabilis, a miraculous season of discovery. He had taken in hand three of the greatest questions of science: the nature of light, the mathematics of change, and the force that binds the cosmos, and in each of them made breakthroughs that would define his legacy. What others might have seen as years of isolation and wasted time became for him a period of extraordinary creation. It is striking to imagine the contrast, the silence of the countryside, broken only by the rustle of trees and the sound of distant church bells tolling for the dead, while in one young man's mind the foundations of modern science were taking shape. Newton himself would later look back on these years as the most productive of his life. They were years when no institution guided him, no formal lectures directed his study, when he was left entirely to his own devices, and it was in that freedom that his genius fully emerged. Yet he did not publish or proclaim his discoveries. He was cautious, secretive, and perhaps uncertain of how his ideas would be received. His habits of solitude, shaped since childhood, inclined him to keep his work private until he felt it irrefutable. The discoveries remained his own, guarded and preserved in his notes, to be shared only when circumstances forced him. By the time the plague abated and the universities prepared to reopen, Newton was no longer the same youth who had left Cambridge. He returned to Woolsthorpe as a student. He would return to Cambridge as a thinker transformed. Within him he carried insights that would one day revolutionize optics, mathematics, and physics. He was ready to rejoin the scholarly world, but now with the quiet knowledge that he had seen further, thought deeper, than almost anyone around him. When the threat of plague lifted and the universities reopened, Newton returned to Cambridge a different man, carrying discoveries that only awaited their moment. When Newton returned to Cambridge in 1667, the shadow of the plague was finally lifting, but within him, the quiet intensity of Woolsthorpe's solitude had left permanent marks. He was not simply resuming his studies, he was re-entering academic life as a man already in possession of discoveries that would change the course of science. His reputation at the university grew swiftly, though at first in small, almost imperceptible ways. He was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, securing both financial stability and a position in the community. In 1669, at only 26 years old, he was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, succeeding his mentor Isaac Barrow. The Lucasian chair was one of the most prestigious academic posts in England, and though Newton himself was not a man who sought titles, it gave him the authority and freedom to teach, to write, and to pursue his inquiries as he saw fit. His first lectures, beginning that same year, were formal, written in Latin, and often read aloud from prepared notes. They were technically dense, difficult even for able students, and attended by only a few. Newton had little patience for rhetorical flourishes or for adapting to the level of his audience. Instead, he poured into his lectures the fruits of his own explorations, lectures on optics that contained insights no one else yet possessed, discussions of refraction and color that hinted at an entirely new understanding of light. To those few who listened attentively, it was clear they were hearing something remarkable, but Newton's natural reticence and his preference for abstraction meant that his lectures had more influence on the future written record than on the young men in the room. But if his lectures drew sparse audiences, his practical work soon drew attention far beyond Cambridge. Among the many challenges of optical science in the 17th century was the problem of telescopes. Traditional refracting telescopes, built with lenses, suffered from chromatic aberration, light refracted differently depending on its color, producing blurred and distorted images. Newton, who had already concluded that white light was composed of many colors, realized that this flaw was inherent in lenses themselves. The solution, he reasoned, was to dispense with lenses altogether. Instead, he designed a telescope that used mirrors, polished metal surfaces that reflected light without separating it into colors. In 1668, Newton constructed his first reflecting telescope, small but powerful, able to produce clearer images than much larger refracting instruments. The device was no mere academic curiosity, it was practical, elegant, and ingenious. Word of this new invention spread quickly. In 1671, Newton presented a refined version to the Royal Society in London, the leading scientific institution of the time. There, among seasoned experimenters and scholars, his telescope caused a sensation. It was compact, precise, and demonstrated not only technical skill but also a deep understanding of optics. The Royal Society soon elected Newton a Fellow, and for the first time, he was recognized publicly as a scientist of exceptional promise. This moment was, in many ways, Newton's first step onto the public stage. Until then, most of his work had been private, confined to notebooks and the lecture hall. The telescope was different. It was tangible, visible, and indisputable. With it, Newton was no longer simply an eccentric scholar buried in his chambers at Cambridge. He was an inventor whose work commanded the attention of England's foremost scientific body. Yet with recognition came the stirrings of conflict. The Royal Society was not only a gathering of minds but also a theatre of competition, where theories clashed and egos strained against one another. Newton's discoveries about light and colour, when they began to circulate, challenged long-held views. Many contemporaries clung to the belief that white light was pure and that colours arose from modifications imposed upon it. Newton's assertion that white light was compound, that prisms revealed its hidden components, seemed to undermine this tradition. As Newton's results became known, questions were raised, objections voiced. Some doubted his experiments, others bristled at his confident conclusions. Newton, ever sensitive to criticism, felt the sting of resistance. His manner, reserved and defensive, often made matters worse. He struggled to tolerate contradiction, and when faced with skepticism, he grew irritable, sometimes harsh. The very qualities that made him relentless in pursuit of truth, his unwillingness to compromise, his need for absolute certainty, also made him a difficult colleague. But it was not only scientific opposition that troubled him. Envy, too, played its part. Newton's rapid rise, his youth, and his audacity in proposing new theories aroused unease among older scholars who had spent decades building reputations. He was, to many, both brilliant and unsettling, a figure who threatened to overturn familiar structures. For Newton, who craved acknowledgement but dreaded conflict, the mixture of recognition and hostility was deeply uncomfortable. He withdrew often to Cambridge, preferring the solitude of his study to the storms of London. Still, the period between 1667 and 1675 was crucial. In these years, Newton cemented his academic position, gained national recognition, and began to navigate the complex world of scientific discourse. He had shown what he was capable of through his lectures, his private notes on calculus, his telescope, and his experiments with light. The seeds of future disputes were already sown, but so too was the foundation of his enduring fame. By the mid-1670s, Newton was known not just as a Cambridge mathematician but as one of the most promising natural philosophers of his generation. He had the ear of the Royal Society, the respect of his peers, and a growing reputation beyond England's borders. Yet even as he ascended, he sensed the challenges ahead. Science had given him recognition, but it also carried with it rivalry, critique, and controversy. His discoveries about light, in particular, would ignite fierce debates that would test not only his theories but also his temperament. Science brought Newton fame, but also disputes. Nowhere were they sharper than in the debate over the nature of light. In the years following his first recognition, Newton's attention turned more deeply to optics, and what had begun in Woolsthorpe as simple prism experiments now matured into a full theory of light and color. He argued firmly that white light, long believed to be a pure, uniform entity, was instead a composite, made up of rays of every color. Each color, he claimed, had its own degree of refrangibility, bending at a distinct angle when passing through a prism. From this premise, he concluded that prisms did not corrupt light but rather revealed its hidden structure. To him, this was not speculation but demonstrated fact, proven again and again through experiment. In 1672, eager to share his results, Newton sent a paper to the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society detailing his discoveries. The publication thrust him into the heart of public scientific debate for the first time. At first, many were impressed, but soon critics raised objections. Chief among them was Robert Hooke, the Society's curiously gifted yet combative curator of experiments. Hooke argued that Newton's interpretation was flawed, that colors arose not from inherent properties of light but from modifications impressed upon it by materials. Others suggested Newton had overgeneralized his findings, or that his experiments lacked sufficient precision. What began as scientific criticism quickly took on a sharper edge. Hooke, proud and sensitive about his own contributions to optics, treated Newton's work as a challenge to his authority. Their exchanges grew heated, filled with barbs and dismissals. Newton, ill-equipped for public controversy and deeply averse to conflict, felt attacked not only intellectually but personally. His thin skin and need for certainty made the criticism unbearable. Though he defended his work, supplying further proofs and refined experiments, he found little satisfaction in the quarrels. These disputes left scars. Newton began to withdraw from public debate, reluctant to expose his ideas to what he saw as hostility and envy. Though his theory of light was sound, and would in time be vindicated, the battles convinced him that recognition came at the cost of peace. In the mid-1670s, even as he deepened his optical research, he pulled away from the Royal Society, declining to publish further and retreating into the solitude of Cambridge. The telescope had made him famous, the theory of light had shown his brilliance, but the backlash taught him caution and secrecy. During these years he worked privately, conducting further experiments, improving instruments, and writing extensive notes. He built more reflecting telescopes, tested combinations of prisms and lenses, and elaborated his ideas into manuscripts that circulated only among a few trusted colleagues. His investigations went beyond light itself into color perception, diffraction, and the wave-like behaviors that complicated his corpuscular view. Yet rather than risk more public disputes, he kept his most advanced conclusions unpublished. His notebooks reveal a man still probing tirelessly but guarding his findings from a world he did not trust. Personally, the strain told. Newton's letters of this period sometimes display signs of melancholy and unease. The combination of unrelenting work, social isolation, and conflict with peers weighed heavily on him. Though never one to enjoy company, he now recoiled even further, immersing himself in solitude, preferring the companionship of ideas to that of men. His friendships thinned, his correspondence shrank, and the impression grew of a thinker isolated, almost reclusive, yet never idle. Yet if isolation separated him from the scientific community, it also allowed him to cultivate patience and depth. He was refining not only the theory of optics but his mathematical methods, extending his calculus in secrecy, and pondering gravitation with growing seriousness. Even as one branch of his work stalled in public under the weight of controversy, another was germinating in private, unseen but soon to transform the world. By the early 1680s, Newton's reputation remained strong, but his activity was quieter, his presence in London's scientific circles reduced. Some thought him withdrawn, others thought him broken by criticism. In truth, he was biding his time, continuing to test, to write, and to think, waiting for a subject great enough and urgent enough to call him back into the open. Meanwhile, another work began to take shape, a monumental book that would forever change humanity's view of the universe. In the early 1680s, while Newton was still sunk in the relative quiet of Cambridge, a problem was stirring among natural philosophers across Europe: the motion of the planets. For decades, astronomers had refined the paths of celestial bodies with ever greater precision, and Kepler's laws described their elliptical orbits with astonishing accuracy. Yet the underlying cause remained uncertain. What force kept the planets tethered to the sun? What principle governed the sweep of the heavens? These questions reached Newton through an unexpected visitor in 1684, Edmund Halley, a younger man of energy and vision, already a respected astronomer. Halley had been engaged in discussion with fellow scientists in London, including Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, about the problem of planetary motion. Hooke had claimed that an inverse square law of attraction, a force diminishing with the square of the distance, could explain the orbits, but when pressed for proof, he had none. Halley, seeking clarity, travelled to Cambridge to consult Newton. In the course of their conversation, Halley asked what orbit a planet would follow if it were attracted to the sun by such an inverse square force. Newton, with disarming simplicity, replied that it would trace an ellipse. Surprised, Halley pressed him, how did he know? Newton answered that he had already worked it out years before but had misplaced the papers. Realizing the significance of what Newton claimed, Halley urged him to rediscover or reproduce the demonstration. Within months, Newton sent him a short treatise, De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, on the motion of bodies in orbit. This manuscript laid out the mathematical foundations showing how an inverse square force yields Kepler's elliptical orbits. Halley was electrified. Here was not just speculation but rigorous proof, marrying mathematics with the mechanics of the heavens. He persuaded Newton to expand the work into a full treatise, offering to oversee and finance its publication himself if necessary. Thus began Newton's greatest labour, the writing of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. For over 2 years, from 1685 to 1687, he devoted himself with relentless focus, transforming his notes and scattered insights into a structured, monumental whole. The Principia was not merely a book, it was a new architecture of the universe, grounded in axioms and built with proofs as unyielding as stone. Newton framed the laws of motion, 3 concise principles that governed every body, earthly or celestial. From these laws, using the geometrical methods of the ancients combined with his own mathematical genius, he derived consequences that explained phenomena ranging from falling apples to the tides, from the flight of projectiles to the orbits of comets. At the heart of the Principia lay the law of universal gravitation. Every particle of matter attracts every other with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This audacious law extended across all space, binding together the Earth and the stars in a single system. What Kepler had described, Newton explained. What Galileo had intuited, Newton proved. The heavens and the earth, long treated as separate realms, were now governed by one set of rules. The intellectual strain of producing the book was immense. Newton labored with little rest, absorbed by calculations and demonstrations, driven by a sense of destiny. Halley, true to his promise, acted as editor, encourager, and protector, smoothing disputes and ensuring that the manuscript advanced toward publication. Robert Hooke, ever Newton's rival, attempted to claim priority for aspects of the gravitational idea, provoking bitter quarrels. Newton, furious at what he considered theft of credit, nearly abandoned the project altogether. Only Halley's steady mediation and financial support held him to the task. In 1687, the first edition of the Principia finally appeared. Its impact was immediate, though not universally understood. For some, it was a revelation. The cosmos had become a vast, ordered machine, intelligible through mathematics. For others, the sheer difficulty of the work made it forbidding. Written in austere Latin, filled with geometrical proofs, the Principia was a book for the few, not for the many. Even among scientists, admiration mingled with incomprehension. Many recognized its brilliance but could not follow its arguments in detail. Yet the boldness of its vision and the elegance of its conclusions inspired awe. Across Europe, the book spread rapidly. Scholars in Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, and beyond debated its theorems, tested its predictions, and began to incorporate its principles into their own work. In England, it elevated Newton to a stature beyond that of an ordinary professor. He was no longer simply a Cambridge mathematician or an inventor of instruments, he was the architect of a new cosmology. The mechanical universe he described offered not only explanations of natural phenomena but also a philosophical framework, the world as a rational, law-governed order, open to human comprehension. The Principia did not answer every question. Critics pointed out that Newton had described the law of gravitation without explaining its cause. How, they asked, could bodies exert force across empty space? To many, this seemed like a retreat into occult qualities. Newton himself admitted he could not provide a mechanism, declaring simply that he did not feign hypotheses. The law was certain in its effects, even if its origin remained hidden. For Newton, the precision of mathematics outweighed speculative metaphysics. He left the mystery of cause to the future, content that the consequences were indisputable. Despite such objections, the publication of the Principia marked one of the greatest triumphs in intellectual history. It unified centuries of inquiry, established physics as a mathematical science, and set the stage for every advance that would follow. Newton himself, though often reluctant to bask in fame, could not escape the recognition that now surrounded him. He had become a figure of unparalleled authority, not only in science but in the broader culture of Europe. His voice, once tentative in the halls of Cambridge, now carried weight in courts, academies, and parliaments. After this triumph, Newton became a figure whose voice was heard not only in science, but also in politics. The publication of the Principia in 1687 had raised Newton to heights of intellectual renown, yet it also brought him more directly into the political and administrative currents of England. The last decades of the 17th century were years of turmoil and transformation. The glorious revolution of 1688 swept James II from the throne and brought William and Mary to power, reshaping the kingdom's political and religious order. Cambridge, where Newton had spent so many years in cloistered study, did not remain untouched. Universities were battlegrounds of loyalty and influence, and Newton, by then already a man of authority, was drawn into the disputes. At Trinity College, Newton had risen to senior positions, overseeing not just lectures and students but also the governance of the institution. He defended the autonomy of the college against royal interference, showing a firmness that surprised some of his peers. He was elected as a representative of the university to Parliament in 1689, sitting during the Convention Parliament that confirmed the new monarchy. His participation there was modest. He did not speak often and was far from a political operator, but his very presence symbolized the new recognition of scholars in the political life of the nation. In Parliament, he was known to be diligent, though legend has it that he spoke only once, and even then on a practical matter regarding the repair of a window in Westminster Hall. At the same time, Newton's intellectual interests broadened in ways that revealed hidden depths of his character. While the world admired him as the author of the Principia, he himself turned much of his energy toward theology. He pored over biblical texts, studying them with the same rigorous intensity he had once reserved for optics and mechanics. His writings from these years reveal a man convinced that the scriptures contained encoded truths about history, morality, and the destiny of humankind. He examined prophecies in the book of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, constructing elaborate chronologies and interpretations. To Newton, the universe was not only a machine of laws and forces but also a divine creation with a providential order, and he sought to penetrate that mystery with relentless devotion. Closely linked to these theological pursuits was his fascination with alchemy, or what was then called chemistry. Long before chemistry emerged as a modern science, alchemy represented both the search for material transformation, the transmutation of metals, and a spiritual discipline. Newton copied vast numbers of alchemical manuscripts, performed experiments with furnaces and crucibles, and studied obscure texts filled with symbols and allegories. To his contemporaries, this was a secretive and somewhat disreputable pursuit, and Newton himself kept it largely hidden. For centuries, it remained one of the most surprising aspects of his life, only revealed fully by the later discovery of his papers. In these private studies, Newton seemed to be searching for unity beneath the visible world, a deeper substratum of reality where matter, spirit, and divine will converged. To him, there was no rigid boundary between science, religion, and alchemy. All were paths toward truth. While the Principia established the external laws of the universe, his theological and alchemical writings probed its inner meaning. The public saw only fragments of this, and many who praised him as a model of rational clarity would have been startled by the mystical dimensions of his thought. Yet Newton did not withdraw entirely into esotericism. He continued to refine his scientific work, though now with a maturity and caution shaped by experience. His studies on optics resumed in a quieter mode, leading eventually to the publication of his book Optics in 1704. Unlike the Principia, this was written in English rather than Latin, opening his ideas to a broader readership. It described in detail his experiments with light, prisms, and colors, and advanced his corpuscular theory of light. The book was both experimental and speculative, containing queries that gestured toward new lines of research. Where the Principia was austere, Optics was rich with open questions, inviting readers to share in the process of discovery. During these years, Newton's reputation continued to rise. He was increasingly sought after, both as a scientific authority and as a figure of national prestige. His circle of acquaintances widened to include not only fellow scholars but also statesmen, clergymen, and nobles. The Royal Society, once a place of bitter quarrels for him, now looked to him as a central figure. Younger scientists regarded him with reverence, and even critics acknowledged his dominance. Though still personally reserved, his influence spread into many corners of intellectual and civic life. The duality of his existence, publicly a sober professor and parliamentarian, privately a theologian and alchemist, illustrates the complexity of his character. Newton was not simply the embodiment of modern rational science, he was also the inheritor of older traditions of thought, in which the search for truth embraced both natural laws and divine mysteries. He could describe planetary orbits with mathematical precision, and in the same breath calculate the timeline of biblical prophecy or attempt to unlock the secret of the philosopher's stone. By the beginning of the 18th century, Newton stood as one of the most eminent men in England. He had survived disputes, outlasted rivals, and seen his theories spread across Europe. His fame was secure, yet he was restless, ready to move beyond the confines of Cambridge and the university world that had shaped him. It was a time when scholars could become statesmen, when intellectual authority translated into political trust. For Newton, the next step would take him from lecture halls and manuscripts to the heart of government itself. By the century's end, Newton's path took an unexpected turn. He found himself at the very centre of the state's machinery, the Royal Mint. In 1696, Newton took a step that would mark the beginning of a very different phase of his life. He was appointed Warden of the Royal Mint, an office that carried the responsibility of overseeing England's coinage. On the surface, it seemed a practical administrative role, far removed from the abstract mathematics and celestial mechanics that had occupied him for decades. Yet for Newton, the position offered both a challenge and an opportunity. The mint was plagued by counterfeiting, a serious threat to the economy and to public confidence. Newton approached the problem with the same rigor he had applied to natural philosophy. He immediately began to investigate the operations of the mint, learning every detail of coin production, distribution, and security. Newton's methods were meticulous. He studied the composition and weight of coins, examined reports of forgeries, and analyzed patterns of illicit activity. His commitment to precision and order was evident in every action. No detail was too small to escape scrutiny, and no procedure was too mundane to be improved. Counterfeiters, who had long operated with relative impunity, soon found themselves pursued with an intensity that combined legal authority, scientific insight, and unyielding determination. Newton's campaign against coin fraud was both thorough and inventive. He personally supervised raids, coordinated with law enforcement, and collected evidence with a keen eye for detail. Records from the period describe the fear and respect he inspired. Counterfeiters were prosecuted, and sentences were severe. Newton's discipline in this domain reflected his broader temperament. Just as he had insisted on rigorous proof in mathematics, he demanded precision in governance. Yet there was also a strategic dimension. He understood that a stable currency was not merely a technical matter but a foundation for national prosperity and confidence. His successes as warden led to his promotion to Master of the Mint in 1699, a post he held until his death. In this role, he presided over a comprehensive reform of England's coinage, overseeing the recoinage of silver and ensuring that standards were maintained across the kingdom. The job required administrative skill, diplomacy, and patience, but Newton excelled in all three. He combined scientific knowledge with practical management, demonstrating that a mind trained in abstraction could also govern with effectiveness. His tenure at the Mint is remembered not only for the improvements in currency but also for the rigorous standards he established, which shaped monetary policy for decades. While Newton's responsibilities at the Mint consumed much of his time, he did not abandon his engagement with the broader scientific community. In 1703, he was elected President of the Royal Society, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. This office gave him a platform to influence research, support emerging scholars, and defend the integrity of scientific inquiry. Newton used the presidency to consolidate his authority, but also to guide the direction of English science, encouraging experiments, publications, and debates. The Royal Society became an extension of his intellect, a forum where the methods and rigor he valued could flourish. Newton's dual role as a state official and scientific authority was unprecedented. Few had combined practical power with intellectual eminence on such a scale. He was both a guardian of the nation's coinage and the custodian of its scientific reputation. These roles reinforced one another. His reputation as a mathematician and natural philosopher lent credibility to his administrative decisions, while his position in government expanded his influence in scientific circles. It was a rare convergence of intellect and authority, and it shaped both England's institutions and the global perception of Newton as a figure of unparalleled competence. The work at the Mint also revealed a different side of Newton's character. His intensity, which had long manifested in study and experimentation, now found expression in law enforcement. He could be relentless, meticulous, and unforgiving. Colleagues and subordinates often noted his exacting standards and unbending principles. Yet he was not capricious, his actions were guided by reason, evidence, and a sense of duty. In this way, Newton's personality, reserved, methodical, and fiercely determined, was consistent across all domains of his life, whether in optics, celestial mechanics, or currency reform. During these years, Newton also navigated complex political and intellectual landscapes. The Royal Society was no longer simply a scientific forum, it was entwined with patronage, reputation, and influence. As president, he mediated disputes, defended scientific priorities against rival claims, and maintained the society's standing in the broader world. At the same time, England faced economic, social, and political challenges that required attention. Newton's careful, disciplined approach allowed him to balance these responsibilities, maintaining both scientific and civic credibility. Yet even amidst his triumphs, the passage of time became evident. Newton, once a figure of inexhaustible energy and mental stamina, began to show the subtle signs of aging. His pace slowed, his interests narrowed, and he increasingly focused on the responsibilities that he could most effectively control. The intensity remained, but it was tempered by experience, and by the awareness that life, like the cosmos he had so carefully studied, operated within limits. Through the last decades of his life, Newton's stature remained unparalleled. He embodied the union of intellect, authority, and service in a way that few others could. His contributions were no longer confined to mathematics and physics, they shaped institutions, inspired generations of scientists, and strengthened the foundations of the nation. Yet for all the power he wielded, he remained, at heart, a thinker devoted to understanding the fundamental order of the world, whether expressed in laws of motion, the mysteries of light, or the precise regulation of currency. But time takes its toll. Newton aged, and the final trials of his life lay ahead. By the early 1720s, Isaac Newton had entered the final stage of a life that had spanned more than 8 decades of extraordinary thought and achievement. His physical health was failing, a natural consequence of long years of intense labor, poor diet, and the relentless mental exertion that had defined him since childhood. Yet despite the frailties of age, his mind remained remarkably lucid. He continued to read, to correspond with colleagues, and to reflect on the questions that had occupied him for so long. Those who visited him described a man of penetrating insight, capable of discussing the most complex matters with clarity, patience, and precision, even as his body grew weaker. The intellectual controversies that had marked Newton's career persisted into these years. Chief among them was the ongoing priority dispute with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. Although Newton had developed his methods decades earlier, Leibniz's independent work had gained recognition across Europe, and accusations of plagiarism and priority claims had generated intense debate. Newton, for all his usual restraint, became deeply involved, defending his work with meticulous documentation and careful argumentation. The controversy revealed both his sensitivity to reputation and his deep commitment to truth as he understood it. He sought not merely recognition for himself but clarity in the historical record, ensuring that the origins of ideas were properly traced. Despite these disputes, Newton maintained meaningful relationships with a small circle of students and disciples. He had long attracted admirers eager to learn from him, and in his later years, he became a mentor in a quieter, more deliberate way. His guidance was rigorous, often exacting, but always aimed at cultivating independent thought and disciplined study. He encouraged careful observation, careful calculation, and, above all, intellectual honesty. To those who followed him, Newton remained both a formidable authority and a source of inspiration, a living connection to the foundations of modern science. Over time, Newton gradually withdrew from the active public life that had defined his years at the Mint and in the Royal Society. He still held the presidency of the society and his post at the mint, but much of the day-to-day work was delegated to trusted colleagues. This retreat was not the result of waning interest, but of a recognition that age imposed limits. He devoted increasing attention to reflection, writing, and the consolidation of his legacy. In these quieter years, the scope of his influence became even more apparent. His earlier discoveries, publications, and reforms had created a lasting framework that others could now build upon. Newton's daily routine in these final years reflected a blend of diligence, contemplation, and measured engagement with the world. He rose early, maintained disciplined study hours, and continued to correspond with scholars across Europe. Even as he faced the physical limitations of old age, his mind worked with the same precision and intensity that had characterized his youth. He could still devise experiments, analyze complex problems, and offer insights that stunned those around him. To contemporaries, he embodied the ideal of a life devoted to knowledge, a mind unbowed by the passage of time, and a spirit committed to the pursuit of truth. In 1727, Isaac Newton passed away at the age of 84. His death marked the end of an era, yet it was also the culmination of a life whose influence had already shaped centuries. The nation recognized the magnitude of his contributions. In a fitting tribute to his unparalleled achievements, Newton was accorded a state funeral and interred in Westminster Abbey, among kings, poets, and other luminaries of English history. The ceremony was attended by a wide array of figures from scientific, political, and social spheres, reflecting the breadth of his impact. The streets and halls of London bore witness to the passing of a man who had transformed the way humanity understood the cosmos. Newton's passing was more than the end of a life, it was a symbolic moment in the history of knowledge. His discoveries, publications, and administrative reforms had reshaped science, mathematics, and public administration. Scholars continued to study his works, building upon his theories in mechanics, optics, and mathematics. His methods of rigorous observation, precise experimentation, and logical reasoning became central to the scientific approach itself. To generations that followed, Newton was more than a historical figure, he was a model of intellectual rigor, creativity, and disciplined thought. Even in the immediate aftermath of his death, debates and discussions about his contributions continued. His methods were analyzed, his experiments repeated, and his ideas incorporated into new frameworks of scientific understanding. In this sense, Newton's influence extended far beyond his life, shaping not only the trajectory of science but also the broader cultural perception of rational inquiry. His life had been marked by moments of solitary reflection, intense study, public recognition, and administrative authority, all combining to create a legacy that transcended individual achievement. Newton's final years illustrate the enduring vitality of a mind devoted to discovery. Though his body weakened, his intellect remained undimmed, a testament to a lifetime of curiosity, discipline, and relentless pursuit of truth. He passed from the world physically, but the ideas he had cultivated, principles of motion, universal gravitation, the nature of light, and the methods of scientific investigation, lived on. These ideas would inspire countless thinkers, engineers, and philosophers, shaping not only science but the very way humanity approached knowledge. But Newton's story did not end with his death. It lived on in the way humanity received his legacy. Isaac Newton's legacy stretches far beyond the dates of his birth and death, reaching across centuries and shaping the very framework of modern science. His discoveries created a coherent worldview that allowed humanity to understand the cosmos in a way previously unimaginable. By formulating the laws of motion and universal gravitation, Newton provided a systematic explanation for the movement of planets, the fall of objects, and the interactions of matter on Earth and in the heavens alike. The Newtonian universe was orderly, predictable, and governed by mathematical principles, offering a vision of reality that combined elegance with rigorous precision. This worldview became the foundation upon which countless generations of scientists would build, a cornerstone of intellectual thought that influenced not only physics but the very way humans approached the mysteries of nature. In mathematics, Newton's contributions were equally transformative. His development of calculus, although contested in priority with Leibniz, opened entirely new avenues for solving problems involving change and motion. Calculus allowed the precise modeling of phenomena that had previously seemed intractable, from the orbits of planets to the flow of fluids. Beyond its technical utility, the invention of calculus symbolized the power of human reasoning to extend understanding beyond direct observation, to predict and manipulate the natural world through abstract thought. Newton's methods demonstrated that mathematics was not merely a descriptive tool but an instrument of discovery, a language capable of revealing hidden structures and relationships. The influence of Newton's work extended well beyond the laboratory and the lecture hall. Philosophers of the Enlightenment, inspired by the clarity, rationality, and predictive power of Newtonian science, adopted his principles as models for thought in ethics, politics, and society. Figures like Voltaire and Locke celebrated the Newtonian method as emblematic of reason itself, an approach that prized evidence, logic, and systematic analysis. Newton became more than a scientist. He became a symbol of intellectual rigor, a standard against which all claims to knowledge could be measured. His example suggested that human reason, applied carefully and methodically, could unlock the deepest truths of the universe, challenging superstition, dogma, and unquestioned tradition. In the centuries following his life, Newton's theories dominated scientific thought. Classical mechanics, built on his laws of motion and gravitation, became the framework for understanding physical reality from the terrestrial to the celestial. Engineers, astronomers, and natural philosophers relied on his insights to design machines, chart the heavens, and explore the material world. The precision of Newtonian predictions instilled confidence in the capacity of human intellect to comprehend and manipulate natural forces. Even as new discoveries emerged, from electromagnetism to thermodynamics, the Newtonian foundation remained central, a stable reference point from which further advances could spring. Yet the true measure of Newton's influence lies not only in the direct application of his discoveries but in the mindset he embodied. He exemplified patience, observation, experimentation, and relentless attention to detail. He showed that deep understanding required both imagination and discipline, intuition and rigor. In his life, intellectual curiosity was inseparable from a structured method, and this balance inspired countless students, scientists, and thinkers to pursue knowledge with the same combination of creativity and exactitude. Newton's legacy, therefore, is as much cultural and philosophical as it is scientific, representing an enduring model of how disciplined inquiry can transform human comprehension. As science evolved into the modern era, Newton's contributions remained essential, even as new theories refined and, in some cases, surpassed his framework. The advent of relativity and quantum mechanics challenged classical assumptions, revealing that the universe behaves in ways that depart from Newtonian predictions under extreme conditions. Yet even these revolutionary developments stand on the groundwork he laid. Relativity and quantum theory may reinterpret motion and gravitation, but they do so with reference to Newton's laws, either as limiting cases or as historical precedents. In this way, the intellectual scaffolding Newton created continues to support the advancement of knowledge, linking centuries of inquiry in a continuous chain of discovery. Newton's influence also permeated the popular imagination. The image of the solitary thinker, rigorously exploring the laws of nature and achieving profound truths, became an archetype in culture and education. Schools, universities, and research institutions adopted the Newtonian approach, teaching students to combine observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning. Literature, philosophy, and art drew upon his example, portraying him as the embodiment of rational inquiry and the transformative power of intellect. He became, in essence, a cultural as well as a scientific icon, a figure whose life story symbolized the triumph of human curiosity and perseverance. Moreover, Newton's life demonstrated the interplay between solitude and achievement, between private contemplation and public impact. His greatest discoveries often emerged in isolation, in quiet study, or in periods removed from the demands of society, yet their consequences resonated globally. This pattern highlighted a key lesson for future generations, that intellectual breakthroughs often require both deep immersion and fearless exploration. Newton's example encouraged others to value both concentration and courage, to seek understanding in spite of obstacles, and to recognize that transformative ideas frequently emerge from sustained effort and careful reflection. Even today, Newton's legacy is visible not only in physics and mathematics but in the methodology of science itself. The principles he exemplified, empirical observation, hypothesis testing, mathematical modeling, and systematic reasoning, form the backbone of scientific practice across disciplines. From biology to engineering, from astronomy to computer science, Newtonian reasoning continues to provide a model for inquiry, demonstrating how structured, logical investigation can yield insight into the most complex and hidden aspects of reality. The enduring relevance of his methods confirms the profound durability of his influence. Ultimately, Newton's life and work illustrate the extraordinary impact that one individual can have on the course of human thought. He reshaped the way humanity perceives the universe, expanded the tools for intellectual exploration, and established a paradigm of reason and rigor that has guided generations of scholars. His discoveries, his approach to learning, and his persistent pursuit of truth transformed not only science but the broader understanding of human potential. Newton's story is a testament to the power of curiosity, discipline, and imagination, showing that a single mind, dedicated to uncovering the laws of nature, can indeed change the trajectory of civilization. Newton's life is proof of how one man can change the entire course of human thought.